everyone, not everyone, but many guests who come into our stores looking for a house plant, it's in the back of their mind. I mean, whenever you buy any plant at any of our stores, you usually do think about the flowers. Of course, thinking about the leaves and the roots and the whole pot and the whole system is the whole picture. But it's always just in our nature to really want to know, like, does it flower? What does the flowers look like? How do I get more of them? They're the most exciting parts of the plant. I mean, I think in general, in any kind of situation, especially for all organisms, the reproduction of the organism is like this moment of excitement, and it always has a little bit more fanfare to it. And flowers are absolutely a great example for that. They bring the color, they bring the interest. They're how they actually get more seeds, more of the flowers to actually propagate. So it's a really fun topic that I almost felt a little bit indulgent doing. I was really excited to make this webinar and just bring all these pictures of flowers and all these talk about all these flowers. Compared to what I usually do is just like the whole process of the plant. And of course, we're going to go into a lot of care for a lot of these plants just because how you get flowers really does depend on your care. So they're going to be linked together, but we're going to a little bit more focus on what actually brings the flowers, what they look like, and what to expect from that whole process. Um, so again, thank you for joining us today. This one is going to be mostly focused on indoor plants, of course, because a lot of times when we are looking at plants in our outdoor areas, flowers are definitely a big part of it, and they're a little bit more easy to think about. And you have your daisies and your geraniums, and you know their flowers already. But a lot of times you come into our indoor floors, and it's really more foliage based. We have a lot of greens, really cool leaves, and all this stuff around. But flowers are not as present, although there are a really good amount of them that are always really showing in our stores. I'm going to talk about those as well as talking about some that maybe aren't as present or aren't as obvious for guests who come in. So I think the first thing we always got to talk about, and we always have to discuss because it's a very important process of this whole system, is the fertilization. And so fertilizing for flowers is a really interesting and slightly different method than just fertilizing in general, although you use similar components, and we always have to talk about the NPK. So in general, when you're fertilizing for a flower, you want to use your bloom food. So a lot of foods these days are marketed quite well. They have bright pictures on them. They say bloom, they say flower, they say fruit, they say all the different kinds of things they want to like give you the idea of you use this food for that specific process. But in general, you want to actually know what's inside the food and what is the actual percentages and the numbers, what they actually mean, so that you can understand not just by going by the label that the marketing team made for that food, but also understand the components that you're actually putting into your soil. Bloom foods generally are ones that high percentages of phosphorus. And so phosphorus is this middle code of our NPK code. It's on all of our fertilizers. You can see it on every one of them. There's usually a number, it's dash, a number, a dash, and a number. And when you're looking at those, and we've talked about this many times, you're looking at the nitrogen, the phosphorus, and the potassium. So N is for nitrogen. It's the percentage of nitrogen within that fertilizer compared to the mass, the quantity of it. Then there's a percentage of phosphorus and potassium. So something I actually had a really fun time doing preparing for this webinar, and I kind of did a little bit of a deep dive down a rabbit hole on actually understanding what those nutrients are doing on the microbiological level of the plant, like actually looking at the cellular structure and the microbes moving around and how they're actually being affected by these different components to really understand why we want this percentage difference. So I'm not going to go too deep into it because that's a little bit too much for this class on flowers, but nitrogen is your vegetation. You always hear that. It's for your green growth. It's for your leaves. It's for your stems, and you're just growing the plant bigger and better. But what nitrogen really is doing is building your chlorophyll. It's providing a cell division. So it's what's really important for that cells to actually divide and become more and more cells. And it's for protein synthesis, which is a huge process within all living things of actually making proteins, because proteins kind of are the building blocks of all of our life structures and everything like that. So nitrogen is really bringing the structural mass to the plant, and that's why it is growing out the green growth. It's growing the plant bigger and better and bigger leaves because you're getting that vegetation bigger. We're going to jump to the other side because we're going to talk about phosphorus last, but potassium, it's always this kind of nebulous one. We always say it's for the health, it's for the stress of the plant, it's for the resistance of the plant. And sometimes that doesn't really make too much sense. And I actually went into this webinar not knowing a lot about what potassium actually did, but I really learned it's about the water uptake. It's about the turgor pressure and the cell wall growth of the plant. So it's not multiplying the cells, but it actually is elongating and stretching the cells out. It's also regulating how much water is getting into the plant and helping the plant actually hold its structure. And when the plant is very limp and dry, it kind of gets wilty and it's a little bit soft. And then when it fills up with water, because it pulls all that water in, it gets turgor, and that's what turgor pressure is. It's getting stronger, it's getting more full, and all the cells are filling up with water and all that kinds of stuff. And that's actually being facilitated by potassium pumps, and that's why the potassium is really important. It also is very important for different kinds of stresses and different kinds of resistances, but that's really just because the plant is healthy and strong from these potassium pumps that are happening throughout the system. Now, phosphorus. Phosphorus is what today's class is pretty much about, and it's for your blooms and it's for your roots. We always recommend a higher phosphorus food for transplantation because it helps your roots start growing. And we always recommend it for if you're trying to get some flowers or fruits on your plant because it helps the blooms and the flowers grow. But what it's really doing is actually providing the energy to the plant. So ATP is our energy within our cells. If you've taken the science class, you probably heard the term ATP. It's what the cells in your body are making for the energy, or so what the cells in the plant's body is making for the energy. And the P is for phosphorus. And so it is the structure that actually relies on phosphorus to have energy. And if you think about a plant, if a plant's growing and it has all these beautiful leaves and stems, to produce flowers, the plant has to throw a whole bunch of energy, and to produce fruits, it's even more energy into this structure that's not normally there. And so high amounts of phosphorus produces more energy for the plant, which it actually can devote to these secondary compounds and secondary structures, which are your flowers and your fruits. It also helps with hormone regulation, which is how it can actually activate its flowering structure and flowering time. And then phosphorus is also a pretty important structure within our DNA. So in general, you always need DNA to be replicated and more DNA to be inside your cells for you to make more cells. And so phosphorus has to be present for more cells to be made as well. Again, a little bit more of a deep dive than probably anyone was really expecting, but I think it's really fascinating to see what those compounds are actually doing for the plant and why we choose a code that has a higher middle number with the more phosphorus to really produce that energy to really help the plant produce those flowers and actually get growing. I also have some nice pictures on the side here. So we have tapping roots, we have tiger bloom from Fox Farm, we also have maxi. Those are my main foods I usually go to, but I have a wall here. This is our wall in the store that I work at Sloat the Sloat by the zoo. And there's a lot of foods on the wall. A lot of them can be used for different kinds of things, but generally, if you're going for your blooming cycle during that middle of springtime, go for one that has that higher number or at least has a pretty good amount of phosphorus inside of it. You can absolutely use a all-purpose fertilizer throughout the entire year, and your plant will do everything it needs to do. It'll have the phosphorus, it'll have the nitrogen, it'll have the potassium. But if you're trying to really induce something or truly, force it into a good big flowering period, or there's a lot of blooms, or your lemon or whatever is growing has all these flowers and all these fruits on it, you need to give more energy to that plant through this kind of through this potassium. So, all right, we're going to be done talking about fertilizers in general, but this entire class, fertilizer is going to be coming up the entire time. So all the plants that we're going to go into, I'm going to be talking about their light, their water, and their fertilization, because that is really the main components for a good, healthy plant structure and good, healthy plant growth. So think back to this slide when I'm talking about you need a little bit of this kind of fertilizer or this kind of thing. This is what I'm talking about, so you can relate back to it. All right. So I've actually organized these slides and this presentation into kind of what a question I could get in the store. I walk around the store all the time and I have people approaching me, asking me questions about plants because that's what I do. And I love to hear what people want to say and what their questions are. And I love to work with them on that. And some of these questions are what come up pretty regularly. And I want to show you what I would do and what plants I would bring you towards when you actually bring up that kind of question. So I get this quite often, right? Where are your flowering house plants? I'm standing in the middle of the indoor floor and there's all these plants all around me and they're like, oh, where are your flowering ones? So in general, all of the plants around me, I think except for the ferns and maybe a few conifers, but mostly ferns in the indoor floor, not very many conifers, everything else is an angiosperm. And everything in an angiosperm is a flowering plant. And so every plant around me is a flowering plant. But where would I take you first? Of course, the orchids. So orchids are an amazing flowering plant that is immensely diverse. I think it's actually the most diverse genus or most diverse family in all the plant kingdom right now because we are cultivating it so much and we are producing so many different kinds of flowers for our use and to see and beautify our homes. Like it's an incredibly amazing trade that is been growing over years, and it's just incredible plant to have. And I honestly am not going to go too deep into orchids because we have some amazing orchid classes that we have already on our YouTube page and on our website. So, the webinar on orchid basics is by a person who has so much knowledge, and I actually looked at his presentation before this class just to see kind of what he was going into, if I have to reiterate anything. And honestly, I would go watch that one to have a really good idea about what orchids really need. There's also a whole class on how to repot orchids on our YouTube page too, which gives you a little bit of idea about transplanting them and their root structures and all that kinds of stuff. So I don't want to go too much into orchids because there's so many other plants that I want to talk about and everyone knows of orchids already. But I thought I'd bring you some really pretty pictures of ones that I've been growing or ones I've seen in our store. I really love this one right here. It's a dendrobium orchid I've been growing for many years. They have these beautiful pink flowers, really cool thick stems. I also have this whole cluster over here of pretty much most of my orchids I have in my house right now that are all the different kinds of dendrobiums and the some of the coconut orchids, which is this one right down here, as well as a few other ones that I picked up at different stores. And there's even a vanilla orchid in there. So a widely diverse plant or a family and genus in general that when you walk into our store, you'll always see a beautiful blooming orchid. Often we don't bring in an orchid that's not blooming, so you usually buy it with at least some buds on it. And there are some really good tips about how to buy certain orchids and which ones you should look for. But in general, get one that has a few flowers on it, but mostly some close buds, and you'll be quite happy. And there's some great food for them too. But we're going to move on because I really want to talk about some of the plants that maybe we aren't as familiar about or maybe don't know as much about their flowering process. But arguably, the next one we do know quite a lot about. So bromeliads. Bromeliads are a really interesting plant that is in all of our stores. It brings a lot of color to our stores as well as your homes. They are really bright. They have a beautiful inflorescence on them. And so an inflorescence is the flowering structure of a plant. So if a plant has one little flower, its the inflorescence is its flower. But in the bromeliad's case, it produces these really brightly colored stalk of, I think there's some sort of bracts or leaf-like petals that goes all the way up. And then actually out of those colorful structures are the little flowers. So you can see right here on this little pink one right here, this purple little flower is the actual flower of the bromeliad, while the inflorescence is this whole structure that will produce many of those flowers. Bromeliads are closely related, or actually are a pineapple. And if you think about a pineapple, it has this big head with many leaves coming out of it. And actually all those little cells in the pineapple that you eat are different flower fruit or fruits that come from the flower. So there's a multi-flower that actually fill in. And so that's why these bromeliads have these large structures. Even this one right down here, you can kind of see the little flowers are starting to peek out the top, and they'll come out the sides of each of these little red areas, or whatever color that bromeliad is. In general, they are a bright light plant, so they like to be in a bright situation. You can actually be pretty versatile with them. You can have them right in a window, or you can have them pretty far away. If it's really, really bright, it might get a little bit of a sunburn on its leaves. You can kind of tell by discoloration on the most curved part of the leaf. Or if it's in a really, really dark area, they might get a little bit rotten, or they might, start to develop some fungus inside its cells and die back. And if it's not getting too much light, then it can't actually go through that water, and it can be a problem for the plants as well. So right in the middle is pretty good, but they do like a bright light. They like a pretty diluted fertilizer, but it is good to fertilize them. They actually are pretty closely related to orchid fertilizers. There's also some bromeliad food that is specific for them, but in general, if you have a nice liquid fertilizer, maybe dilute it a little bit more than it's recommended and fertilize into that plant's cell structure. So in general, the bromeliads also have a structure that is kind of a cluster of leaves coming out from a central rosette. And inside that little cluster, there's actually little cups that you can put the water into. And so many people recommend, and it's actually just a common practice, and it's quite easy to do, is watering into those little cups of the bromeliad. And when you fertilize, you can do the same kind of thing, just fertilize into those little cups, and it will soak into the little plant, and the plant will uptake the nutrients and uptake that structure and get growing. So they're an interesting word actually came up when I was looking into bromeliads is they're monocarpic. So monocarpacy is when a plant, mono meaning one, carpacy or carpic is a flower. So it's a one flowering period. And so these are plants that are technically kind of an annual. Whenever we talk about that process of monocarpacy, it is for annual plants. It's a plant that produces a flower stalk, seeds itself, and then dies back. If you think about like an agave producing a huge flower stalk, seeding itself, and then the whole structure dies back, it's very similar to a bromeliad where it will produce these inflorescences, which arguably last for many, many months. They actually are quite sturdy and long lasting, but eventually, when it does its flowering process and had its time, that flower stalk will die back and the mother plant will slowly die back down. That happens over a long period of time. Those green leaves actually stick around for a long time, but it is on its process out. But the nice thing about bromeliads is they produce pups, which are all these little structures. It's kind of hard to see in some of these pictures here, but they will produce little baby versions of themselves all around the ring of the base of the plant. And those will grow in, and they're taking the nutrients from the mother plant and producing them into little pups, and then those will grow bigger, and then they flower themselves. So in general, although it is a technically an annual plant that is dying back, it is producing more, and they're flowering, and they just keep on going. You'll have a bit of a cluster of flowers eventually instead of just one. Um, and this cycle actually happens over a pretty long period of time. Takes a couple of months, mostly actually a couple of years. So if you have a bromeliad that is dying back right now or has died back and it's just green, give it some time, give it a little bit of fertilizer, give it a little bit of sunlight. It's producing its pups. It'll probably flower again from those, but that mother stalk will not flower again. All right. So that's a little bit more about bromeliads. Let's keep on moving down the line of the plant that I would bring you to probably first when you say, hey, where are your flowering plants? And next will be an Anthurium. So Anthuriums are a mainstay in all of our stores, and it's actually in many stores across the world. It's in all of our grocery stores. It's in all of our little markets. It's in all these different places because they're very easy to produce. They're very easy to grow, and they're so bright and pretty. They have these vivid colors on their flowers. They're like their hues are so bright and full. They have these reds. They have these, even this one's a black one right here. There's yellows, there's pinks, there's whites. So there's all these really nice bright colors. They have these waxy leaves that are, sorry, and waxy leaves and also these waxy blooms. So these flowers are a spath, which is a type of flower that produces that little kind of corn-looking center part. There's a lot of different plants. There and peace lilies and other ones are also spaths as well. And these flowers are so sturdy. They last for many, many months for the most part. I mean, it depends on how well you take care of it, but they last for a long period of time. And they just keep this color. They're year-round bloomers, so you can actually find of one flowering pretty much at any time of the year. Of course, they will flower more in the spring and summer. That's pretty much a mainstay for all the plants we're going to be talking about. But these are ones that if you would like a flower all year round, they do produce flowers consistently. Um, when the flowers are dying back and they're starting to wilt off a little bit, I know sometimes people will leave on leaves that are dying back so they get the plant still gets a little bit of that energy. But in general, when the flower is dying back, it's a pretty good idea to come in and snip it off and cut it back. That's called deadheading. We do it in a lot of our plants throughout the store. But the nice thing about these ones is since they die back so slowly, if you cut it off on a little bit on the earlier side, it actually stops the amount of energy that the plant is putting into that flower and allows it to put that energy into a new flower or new leaf structure or roots or whatever it really needs to keep on growing. So it is pretty good to come in and deadhead and prune your flowers off if they are not looking the most peak condition. And if sometimes if you even cut it really early, you can put it into a vase and have it as a nice flower arrangement, and the plant will even just keep on producing flowers because it has that energy to keep on going. They're relatively light on fertilization, so you really only need to do it maybe once a month or once every other month, depending on the concentration of your fertilizers. If your fertilizer has really low numbers, like a 222 or a 343 or whatever it kind of is, then you want to fertilize a little bit more often, maybe every couple of weeks or maybe once a month or so. If your fertilizers are like 16, 16, 16 or 424 or whatever it is, then that usually means that you want to fertilize a little bit less often. It's going to be a lot more dose of fertilizer all at once, and the plant can kind of work through it, and then you can fertilize again. You don't want to throw too many strong fertilizers out of plants too often, and especially this one requires a lighter feeding than many other of the house plants that we're going to talk about today. And when you do it that properly, you'll get a plant that just blooms for you all year. You'll have a really pretty one that has these nice waxy leaves. They like to be in a fairly dim situation, so they don't need to be right by the window. They're actually pretty versatile again, so you can kind of have them in some different sunlights, but generally diffused light away from the window, maybe a north-facing or east-facing window situation, or a room that does get some bright light, but not as much as some other plants require. And so that's our amazing Anthurium that we have available to us. And then lastly, in this little section I have is begonias. And oh, begonias, they're amazing and tricky. I find that begonias are one of those plants that whenever I see one, I want it. And they're so pretty. They have the most brilliant leaves. Like this is just, I mean, I only have two or so on here, and there's a huge, huge, huge variety of leaf colors and shapes and patterns and flower types all around in this begonia world that we're living in. Um, the flowers come in many colors, like I was saying, but mainly around pinks. So whites to pinks to reds are generally where you'll find yourself for a begonia, but I'm sure there's a vast variety of them that I just don't even know about. Um, they are they like a consistent fertilization because they actually produce a lot of these secondary structures. Their flowers are pretty consistent. They also have these really brilliant leaves in these small root structures. So they do like a consistent fertilization. You, of course, don't want to over fertilize, which means every week you're just putting in a whole bunch, but you generally want to have a nice regimented schedule. So you want to come in, is it every 2 weeks or every month, depending on your fertilization, again, how diluted you have your fertilizer. You want to come in and just keep it getting some energy, getting some food, producing those beautiful leaves, as well as giving it a little bit of a bloom food, maybe in the spring and summertime. When you actually see those little flower buds starting to form, or the plant is looking nice and bulky and healthy, and you're like, oh, I bet it's going to flower soon. That's when you want to throw a little bit of fertilizer into your fertilizing, or sorry, a little bit of bloom food into your fertilizing regimen. Um, and in general, they like a pretty filtered sun. So I would find that they are a little bit on the tender side. They are more of an understory plant. They like to hang out with other plants. They like a humid area, so they like to be around other things. That means they don't need full sun. They don't need to be exposed completely to all the nature has to offer to them. So a little bit of an indirect light is best. If you have them in a window, make sure that window is maybe a little bit blocked off by some trees in the distance, or if the window is really bright, maybe have it a couple feet back or maybe in the corner of the room to let it have a, a good amount of light, but not too blurry. Because if you have a good lighting situation and you have a good watering situation, your plant's going to grow, your plant's going to flower. Fertilizer just kind of helps you along the way. It gets you a little bit farther, gets you a little bit more of that energy into that system. And like I was mentioning, they actually really love high humidity. And it's pretty hard for us, especially in our houses and our daily lives and all the craziness that goes on around the rest of our life. It's hard to really keep a plant highly humidified consistently. And there are lots of little methods around it. And I think you can imagine some of them being humidifiers or being humidity trays. We'll talk about a little bit more of that here and there and some other plants we're going to talk about. But I've also noticed that if you can dome your plants in one of those little cloches or even a plastic bag sometimes, when it's producing its leaves, it needs a fair bit of humidity around it for them to unfurl and grow out nice and naturally. If they are very dry, you get crispy leaves quite fast. It's a quick downfall to a begonia that is struggling. You'll have a beautiful one for a little while, and then the situation of your house changes. You'll have the heater on a little bit more, or it's not having enough fertilizer or nutrients or whatever happens, it'll crisp up and die back within a very short amount of time. And it's a little heartbreaking. And it's why this little bottom note I have right here, I admire begonias so much. As I was saying, they are very pretty. They're a wonderful plant to try out and see how well you do with them, but they are probably the most difficult plant for me to grow. I have many of them and I have struggled with every single one. And I don't want to dissuade you from them, but it is just giving you the information and knowledge to approach this with the right mindset to actually, have a good experience with your plant, with your flowering plant, which in this case could be a begonia. I also wanted to point out that if you were involved in my propagation class I did 2 weeks ago, I had these pictures right here. This is my before and after of trimming and propagating this begonia. And before this whole process happened, this is what the flowers looked like. It flowered amazingly in my room. And then I came in and I trimmed it back and I propagated it and made another plant out of it. So it is this whole process that you learn from these begonias and a lot of these plants in general. You'll see the whole life cycle when you have your plants indoors, especially if they're a flowering one. All right. So next question is, do those plants even flower? Which is a really funny question to have in general, because a lot of times what I would say is, well, of course they do. They're an angiosperm. They're a flowering plant. But a lot of times you'll see plants that will consistently not look like they have flowers on them. And or they'll just be a nice green plant and you want to know, hey, what's that going to produce if I want it to flower? And the first one we're going to talk about, which I think I talk about in every one of my classes, is the Dracaenas. Um, and Dracaenas and Sansevierias, although as I mentioned before, they are now lumped together into the Dracaena genus. I'm not going to say a snake plant is a Dracaena because I'm going to call it a Sansevieria for at the moment until that needs to change, but they are together and you can actually see it really in their flowers. And it's something that you don't see very often. The flowers are quite rare. Angiosperms all have the capability of flowering, but really a lot of them will produce or reproduce through vegetative propagation. Pieces are getting cut off, or sticks are going to the ground, or however it needs to happen. A lot of these plants, especially how we cultivate them, are propagated through vegetative growth and not propagated through seeds, but they still have the capability of flowering. They had to at some point because seed propagation is how plants evolve. They're actually, the genetic makeup can actually be changed and shifted around, and mutations can happen, and a plant can actually evolve with the world through seed propagation compared to vegetative propagation. And so they have to flower at some point, right? They're kind of funky. You don't really need them. A lot of times they are a special treat when you find a snake plant or a Dracaena or something like that flowering that you don't really expect to flower. But often, as I was mentioning before, flowers take a lot of energy. And so if you have a plant that you don't really need the flowers on and you're really growing it for your vegetative growth, cutting off the flower early or cutting off the flower will stop the extra energy going to that process and allow the plant to put its energy into its leaves or its other structures that you're really more growing it for. So just know that it's totally fine to trim off a flower. It's just the process of gardening and being a house plant or a gardener or someone who owns plants is knowing what you want to do to get the most out of the plant that you have. And so trimming it off is a totally fine process. Or if you want to enjoy it, go for it. It's fun. All right, we're gonna flip ahead to Calatheas. Ooh, another plant that's a little bit tricky. Everyone kind of has their own mindset about growing Calatheas. Some people love them and grow them all the time. Some people really struggle with them, and it's to a very valid amount because they are one of those plants that are a little bit of a diva. When they don't have a perfect situation, they struggle a little bit and they'll show you. But let's go for some just care so you can get the most out of a Calathea that you can. They love an indirect bright room. So they like a lot of sunlight, or not a lot of sunlight. They like a lot of bright light in sunny rooms, but they don't really want to be right in the sun. They sometimes have pretty tender leaves. They have lots of really dark leaves, and it usually means that if it gets too much sun, it's pretty easy for them to get overloaded and burn or get a little bit of like a sun damage on them. They also like a pretty warm area. They're kind of this tropical, beautiful little plant that likes a lot of humidity, but they also like a lot of warmth. So their temperature range is within the 65 to 75 degree kind of range, which honestly most houseplants sit within, and it's actually what we like to sit within. So if you're very comfortable in your skin inside your house, then generally the plant's usually fine. If you're feeling cold and a little bit clammy, the plant's probably feeling cold, a little bit clammy. And if you're like, oh my God, it's so hot in here, it's sweating, your plants are probably feeling the same way and they need a little bit more water. So kind of, feeling yourself, how you're feeling in your situation, the plants will be a similar situation. So you can kind of just think about temperature in that sense. Humidity is a big one for these ones as well. Similar to the begonia, they love constant and high humidity. And there's a lot of ways you can achieve that. Like I was mentioning before, humidity trays are trays underneath the plant that have rocks inside of it that you put excess water, that the water then evaporates and puts water into the air, into a mistier kind of situation. Grouping plants is actually one of the easiest ways that you can create a nice humidity bubble around your plants so they all can be a little bit happier. And it really just means having more plants, which I'm down for. If you have a bunch of plants all fairly close together, I mean, if you're touching too much, you can have some pest problems. But in general, if you have plants closer together, then they're creating a bit of a humidity situation for themselves because they're all transpiring, they're all pulling up water, and then they're kind of throwing it into the air, and they're all just kind of, basking in this nice little humidity bubble that they're making. You can come in and mist your plants. I like misting my plants. It is not a perfect method. You can't just mist your plants once a day or once a week and have a nice humidity area, but it does help out. It also is a nice moment where you can go into your plant, you can mist it and actually check on the leaves, check on the soil, see if there's a flower coming. It's a moment where you can actually really connect with your plants, which is why I use my misting. That's how I use it. And then humidifiers are always something that we can't talk about. There's trickiness to those, or having an energy source that's always pumping out some sort of mist is can be a little bit hard for some people, and they can also add a lot of moisture to your walls, and mildew can be a problem. So you have to be careful with them. But humidifiers are another way of increasing humidity. But in general, what I was saying before is high humidity is good, but it's really consistency. Calatheas can actually survive in moderate or lower humidity as long as it's nice and consistent and they're growing their leaves into that situation where they know what's going to happen. If it's fluctuating all over the place and you're giving a lot of humidity one day and none the other day and back and forth, that's when you have some struggle with your leaves and you'll get brown tips and you'll get a little bit of a crinkliness or the leaf won't really produce as well or will unfurl as easily. So that's kind of what happens there. They're one of the only plants that I will ever recommend using distilled water. I don't really like to recommend using distilled water just because it's a very hard and inaccessible expense that many people don't feel like it feels like a gatekeeping kind of thing. But in general, plants that can't really move through or use the extra salts inside the water that we always have in all of our waters. All of our water has different kinds of capabilities from our pipes, from our flora, from all the different kinds of things that are in our water. If it's a hard water situation that has a lot of minerals inside of it, Calatheas specifically do struggle with that situation. And so if you have a way to filter your water or use a distilled water, they do appreciate it and you'll get less of those, again, brown tips at the end of the leaves. And then fertilizing pretty consistently. They need a pretty consistent fertilizer. A nice balanced NPK is great for them. You want to do it every couple of weeks or every couple of months. I just think every couple of weeks is probably better for these, and you can do it at a lower dilution if you actually are doing it a little bit more often. And then if you actually do want these blooms, which I know I haven't really talked about too much, but it's because you don't really see Calatheas blooming very often. It's not super common. And so don't be discouraged if you're like, oh, mine never has flowered and I've had it for 3 years. That's totally fine. Maybe it will tomorrow. You never know. Giving a little bit of bloom food in the spring could actually induce some of those flowers. And they're kind of funky looking. This is a really bright orange one. We have some nice white ones. They have these little kind of rosette clusters. They almost look like a little bromeliad sticking on a stick. So it's kind of fun if you can get one, but don't be discouraged. They are mainly grown for their leaves anyway. So it's a fun flowering houseplant that really is more for a foliage. All right, we're gonna step away from Calatheas and talk about Hoyas. Ooh, Hoyas, aren't they fun? I have gone through a whole amount of feeling about Hoyas. I didn't like them so much at the beginning. I thought they were a little bit on the boring side, and then as I learned about them and started growing them, I was so fascinated by them, and I got a whole bunch of them. And there was a big Hoya boom in 2020. I remember everyone wanted them, and it kind of died down again. But I think they are a wonderful plant that anyone can grow. They are so sturdy and versatile. They have so much that goes for them. And they have these amazing flowers. I mean, if you look at them, these are pretty close-up pictures. So they're not huge flowers, but they're these awesome little clusters of flowers. They're these bright little stars. Hoyas are called the wax plant for a reason. They have this waxier structure on both the leaves and the flowers that really gives them this sturdiness, that like this long lasting, even when they dry out, they have a very like strong little structure that you can see. They don't just wilt and die away. They stay there. They kind of have a succulent style of leaf. They do like a bright light. So direct sunlight's okay for them. I actually have some of mine in pretty direct sunlight. However, the more direct sunlight you get, the more discoloration will happen on the leaves. And a little bit of discoloration gives you that nice, cute, sun-kissed, like stressed look, which I think is really pretty. Too much discoloration can just brown out or bleach out your leaves, and the plant can suffer in a lot of different ways. So you have to find the balance there, but they can take a little bit of direct sunlight compared to maybe some of the other plants that we were talking about today. Um, they do prefer a lot less watering. Being a succulent type plant and having that structure being so sturdy and they can hold their water inside their cells, they don't want to be wet all the time. If you are consistently watering your Hoya, most likely you're going to see leaves dropping off, yellowing leaves, not too many flowers. You want to let them grow more dry than you feel comfortable, which is sometimes hard for some of us, but you want to let it get to the point where it almost starts to pucker and the leaves start to look a little bit raisiny, not too raisiny, but a little bit more than other plants. And so you want to let that soil get nice and dry, use a very highly drainage-based soil, so rocky or a cactus mix or something like that. And it'll work really well for them. And that little bit of that stress from that low water will help produce more blooms. It's part of their process is if they are too wet all the time, they won't put that energy into that structure. But if they're a little bit on the drier side, they do throw out more blooms for you. Also, fertilizing with some bloom food will, of course, help you along the way. Spring and summer is the best time to do it. I would say do it a little bit on the earlier side for these ones, especially because you don't want to water too much. So giving a little bit more fertilizer in the beginning of the season to get that moving within the system, so that when you water every time, it kind of just moves that minerals around, and then the plant can uptake it and throw some flowers out. They produce these really interesting little whips. So you'll see sometimes a Hoya that has a bunch of leaves in a little cluster, and then all these little tentacly whips that are just flying out in every direction. They have little like root structures all along them, and they look kind of funky. Those are looking for things to grab onto. It's a trailing plant. They want to grab onto something and hold on. Honestly, if they actually find something to grab onto, they'll be a little bit more sturdy, and most likely they will get some flowers on that stem that is holding onto something. But in general, those little whips are going out and searching for new areas to grow, and they also produce the flowers on them. Generally, they flower on newer growth, but they're a plant that will just kind of surprise you. One day you'll be like, I've never seen a Hoya flower in my life. And then next day your plant's covered in them. And you're like, whoa, how'd that happen? So it's a very fun experience. They're really cool looking. And I think it's a great plant to pick up if you want just something kind of easy, fun, and a little bit different. All right. So next question is that even a house plant? And this is a funny one as well, because the question is, you're looking on our indoor floor, and generally our stores are organized where outside is outdoor plants. And so you want to plant them in your outdoor area. Inside our more greenhouses or inside our more indoor floor areas are our indoor plants. So you want to grow in our indoor areas. We kind of make it easy for you like that, as well as we are taking care of them for longer periods of time between selling them. So we want to have them in a good situation. So if you are buying a plant inside, generally it should be an indoor plant. But occasionally we do bring in plants that are more floral and fun and party plants or seasonal plants or something that really has a nice flower interest or something like that. And they can grow inside for a good period of time, but they really are an outdoor plant. So it's finding that balance. And again, I don't want to gatekeep your plants too much, where if you grow something inside and you're like, I've been growing this plant inside for 10 years and it's been doing fine. That's wonderful. And you have a situation that the plant's adapting to and growing well. But in general, if you have a hydrangea and you find a hydrangea on a indoor floor in a cute little basket because it's the Easter hydrangea and it's bright and it's colorful, and you bring it inside and you grow in your house, you can have it for maybe a couple weeks or a month on your counter table and it's beautiful, and it will start to die back its leaves, and then it'll start to die back, all of its flowers will die back, and then the whole plant will be a little bit sad, a little bit weak. It won't have that energy to produce that new structure. It needs the outdoor environment for good full body growth. But you can absolutely enjoy it inside for a good period of time. They have the capability of doing that, and that's why we do tend to have them on our indoor floor. I couldn't get pictures of all of them because I just don't have as many pictures of all of them, but jasmines are one that we've seen in our store quite often. So the pink jasmines are one of those vines that grow beautifully outside anywhere in the Bay Area, anywhere in many parts of the world. They'll grow up a trellis and they'll get huge and beautiful, but we sell them inside in a little hanging basket every once in a while for Easter or for this time of the year when the flowers are producing, because it smells amazing and you'll have a flower show inside your house. But once it's done, I do suggest shifting it to the outdoor area. Same with the hydrangeas. We have these Gerbera daisies over here that are quite pretty and actually been described as a pretty good house plant. So that might actually be able to live in your house for a little bit longer than some of these other ones I'm talking about. But in general, it's a plant that I would consider more herbaceous, more of an outdoor situation. So long-term growth would be better on your porch or maybe somewhere semi-outside or in like your entranceway. But indoors, right by like, your living room, right by your TV, probably not the best situation for the long part of its life. Primroses, cyclamen, which are those beautiful plants during the holiday season or during the winter season. Arbutelons are those flowery maples that grow nice and tall, and I've seen many people try and grow them inside, and they do pretty well for a good while, but they do much better and they grow for longer and they produce better leaves, and there's less chance for bugs and stuff outside. Poinsettias are one of those funky ones that we do actually grow inside quite a lot, and they are a bit more of an indoor plant, but they are a little bit more of a seasonal kind of like shot of color, and then they go away. And you don't have, I'm guessing no one has a poinsettia in their house at the moment, even though it's not that far away since we purchased them. So they are a short period of time inside. They don't really grow that well outside for us, but for some places they do. And there's many more. So just in general, there are temporary plants out there that you'll find on our indoor floor that are beautiful and they're flowering and they're blooming, but do not keep them inside for a long period of time, or if you do, understand the process of that they're going to go through. And one more type of plant that's like that are your blooming bulbs. We have some beautiful bulb webinars as well. So if you ever want to learn a lot about bulbs, we have some classes on that. But in general, I wanted to mention that we will have these inside our indoor floors as well. And they usually are around the season. So you have your narcissus, which is your paper whites, which are going to be generally more in the um, you plant them sometime around November to December, and they flower and they bloom in the holiday season. They bring some nice color and some nice fragrance. They're very fragrant to your indoor area. You might even have a little bit of paper white still left over going right now. I think I have one inside my kitchen area that is still blooming and looking quite nice, but it's almost done. And when they're finished, similar with the amaryllis right over here, these beautiful big flowers that we produce, and they grow from their bulb, and they're really easy to force. Once they're done, they put their energy back into their bulb system, and you can either plant them outside or have the bulb kind of sit in a bit of a dormancy inside a nice, cool, dark area in your house for a little while, and then next season bring them out again. You want to make sure that the plant is able to pull as much nutrients from its leaves and from its flowers in back into its bulb before you actually cut back and store it away or put it back outside. You don't want to disrupt it too much. If you have it flower, and although if you do want to use it for cut flower arrangements, I mean, that's what you're doing. You go for it, you cut it off. But if you cut it off early, then you do end up taking away some energy from the plant, especially if you take out the leaves that is going to go into that bulb for next year's blooming cycle. So just kind of watch out that. Easter lilies are another one that's actually in all of our stores. I took this picture just a couple days ago. They smell amazing. They're really bright. They're really colorful, and they can last for a good while in your house, but they do only flower for a shorter period of time. The leaves will stick around for a little while. They'll usually die back. It's generally a good idea to shift those into your outdoor area coming up in like a month or two if you did buy one recently. And so in general, there are a lot of bulbs that can be started inside or can be grown inside, but many of them are an outdoor plant. And so just kind of keep an eye out for those. All right. So coming up to one of my final sections right here is, what plant would you pick for a friend? Which is a really beautiful and fun question to answer when you come to the store, because it really puts it back on me to be like, what plant do I really like? What plant do I think that your friend might really like? Or what plants do I want to give to my friends? And it's a fun time because a lot of times I do think about, okay, I want a good flower, a plant that has a nice structure. I want something easy to take care of. I want something that maybe has a cool bloom on it. And that's what we're going to talk about right now. The first one is the lipstick plant, which is the Escananthus. It is a really, really amazing, beautiful vining plant that we can grow inside. They have these wonderful little kind of spade-like leaves that grow on these vines. They can trail down. They don't really go too much up, but they can kind of creep around. They have these fuzzy little flowers on them that are really, really cute and bright colored. Usually they're reds or oranges or something like that. They're called lipstick plants because they have this sheath right here at the base, and then the red flower comes out and sticks out from that sheath. And that is what kind of resembles a lipstick coming out of a lipstick cartridge. And but in general, that bright red color is so striking, and sometimes you can have a full cluster of them. This was inside my house in a north-facing window that was getting no direct sunlight, and it was blooming like crazy. It was so happy there. Um, the uh, the general, they want to be in that kind of bright light, but slightly more diffused if you can. But they are pretty versatile as well as many of the other plants, where if you do give them a lot more sun, like this big plant picture right here I have is just, it's like 5 feet away from me right now. It's sitting right in an east-facing window that does have a bit of a screen, so it's a little bit diffused, but it is a bright morning sun that it gets consistently every day. And you can see the purpling on the leaves. That purpling or reddening or whatever kind of color that the leaves produce is a secondary pigment compound that really comes from higher sun. So the more energy that's hitting that plant does tend to stop the chlorophyll is the green stuff and the green on the plant, and that will kind of either denature or die away. And then the purple pigments, which I cannot remember the name of right now, but all the purple pigments and the red pigments will actually become expressed, and they can take the higher intensity light and actually get the plant enough energy to keep on going while still not being green. And so having a little bit of purple in your plant, I think is really, really pretty. So you can have these plants in a nice, bright, sunnier spot. But if it's too much, then they will dry out and die away. And if it's too little, again, and they're really in a dark corner, they're going to grow a little slow. They're not going to flower very much. They're going to be a very kind of pale leaf color and not going to be as happy. So finding that happy medium for these plants is great, and you can actually have them in a lot of situations within your house. But some bright light is pretty necessary. Like the other plants, you can definitely fertilize these with a all-purpose fertilizer throughout the whole year. A little bit of bloom food in the springtime to get those flowers to pop out and be happy, but they're a pretty sturdy plant no matter what. They will actually flower for you pretty consistently if the plant is happy. So keeping it as structurally happy as possible. and repotting it when it needs to and trimming it back when it gets a little bit long. Those flowers grow in those new stems, so you want to make sure that you are coming in and maintaining the plants a little bit more to really get the most out of it that you can. And they also will propagate quite easily. So if you do trim them back, throw those little pieces into water. We had a whole class about propagation 2 weeks ago, like I was mentioning, and you just pop them into some water or some moss or whatever you're going to do, and they'll grow roots, and you have a new plant, and you can give that plant to another friend. And so you can just keep on giving them away or producing more of them, or you have a whole bunch of them right behind you all at once. You never really know. So I think the lipstick plant is one of those plants that is a mainstay in my house. I think everyone, if you want a trailing plant, definitely give it a try. It's quite easy. It's quite fun. The colors are beautiful. You'll have a flower drop every once in a while, so you have to sweep up a few flowers off your floor, but they're nice and they're sturdy. They're a little fuzzy and they're a little strong, so they won't like just kind of melt on your floor. You can just sweep them away. All right, and then the last plant for this section is one of my favorites as well, and it's the Nematanthus. So the Nematanthus is the goldfish plant, and I think in my first webinar I ever did for Sloat, which was a couple of years ago, I featured this plant and I heard about it every day for a good while after that because everyone was like, I'm gonna get a goldfish plant. I'm like, well, that's amazing because I love them so much. They are probably my favorite plant to give away as a gift. They are they have these brilliant dark colored leaves. Even sometimes the leaves on the backside have this shock of red going the back like, kind of margin of the leaf. It's really, really cool looking. They have these succulent leaves, so they're actually a little bit more sturdier. They hold the good water inside them. It makes them a lot easier to take care of because they actually don't need as particular watering. They don't wilt on you as fast, so they actually have a nice structural succulent leaf. Their stems are nice and sturdy, but still flexible. So they will actually grow up. They're not like I mean, some of them can trail around. They can kind of wiggle around throughout your house, but generally they are an upright plant. But the flexibility of the stem allows it to be kind of wavy and moves through. They have a little bit of interest, and they're not just sticks or not very like sturdy little plants that you just can't move around. They kind of move with the motion of the house, and they'll actually give you a little bit of this like kind of wiggling interest, almost looks like kelp growing up, which then you have the cutest looking little flowers. They look like little goldfish. And I always kind of pucker my face and I'm like, they look kind of like this whenever someone comes into the store because they're one of the coolest little like puffed cheeks and little puckered little lips plants that you can get out there. And they look like little fish swimming through a bunch of kelp. So I think it's one of those amazing looking little plants that do flower quite often for me. And it's really hard to pass up. You want to grow them in a pretty moderate to bright light as well. They are kind of ones that, with those darker leaves, they can take a little bit less sunlight, but to produce those flowers and actually grow a little bit faster like they want to grow, a good bright area is best for them. I have mine in pretty much east-facing windows or a little bit farther away from my south-facing window. And they are quick growers, actually. They fill the pot. I need to repot one or two of them. I was taking pictures for this class and I was like, oh, I should probably repot you and give you a little bit of fertilizer. So a lot of these times I think these classes actually make me a better gardener as well because it makes me pay attention to my plants even more. Um, I fertilize mine with a pretty regular all-purpose food. I use Maxi as my main fertilizer in general, so an all-purpose food throughout the whole year. And then I haven't done it in the past years, but I think I'm going to, especially this year, as a little bit of a nice bloom food. I like tap and bloom as my main bloom food. And I'll fertilize them this probably now. It's spring almost right now. So I'll be fertilizing them, see if I can get a nice little flower show to come out of them. And then as they grow out, they propagate really easily as well. Come in, trim them off. Their flowers generally grow all throughout the plant, so newer growth and older growth, but newer growth generally has a better chance of flowering. So coming in and trimming it back a little bit, maintaining the shape, taking those trimmings, putting them in water and propagating them will also both give you more plants as well as some more flowers. So that's my main one for giving away as gifts. I think if anything, if anyone wants to take away anything from this class, it's give your plants as best light and water as you can, fertilize them pretty consistently, and think about your fertilizers, and buy a goldfish plant because I think it's my favorite one. Lastly, I have this slide of a bunch of other plants I was going to talk about today, but I knew I was gonna go over time if I kept on making more and more slides about all these different kinds of plants, but I wanted to show off some of the pictures and other plant options that you have out there. And there are just so many more. All the plants indoors can flower, so they all have a flower to look at some point. But I wanted to show off there are some really nice kalanchoes, which are a mainstay for our plant sections that have some nice and beautiful little flowers on them. They're a type of succulent. Palms flower, similar to the dracaenas. They don't flower very often, and you don't really see them. They're a little bit less noticeable, but they do shoot up these little flowers. These are like almost the fruiting bodies of the flower that I have on my fishtail palm. Alocasia's flower, and I was gonna have a whole slide about how you should be careful about some plants. Plants like alocasias, when they do flower, they throw a lot of energy into their flower, and that actually shrinks their leaves over time. I've noticed that every time my alocasias flower, their leaves get quite small. And so if you want really beautiful, big elephant ear leaves and your plant starts to flower, it's really good to cut those off pretty early or to stop that from happening because that means that the plant is going to probably start shrinking and go into its more reproductive dieback stage. Um, I have a bridal veil in one of my other rooms, which is a really cute, fast trailing, like really fast growing plant that has these little flowers all twinkling out throughout it. Oncidium are just another type of orchid, but I love this little yellow kind of dancing orchid. Looks like a little lady with a dress dancing. And then the crown of thorns is a mainstay in my room as well. It's a nice, sturdy euphorbia type of cactus succulent that produces flowers all year round. I have not seen it without a flower on it in 4 years. So it's a really cool one if you want to have a really nice little green plant that's sturdy and kind of a little bit gnarly looking. It has all these thorns throughout it, and then produces these bright red or pink or orange flowers throughout the year. And then again, I was going to talk about African violets, but I didn't have a lot of time, so I threw it in this last slide here. African violets are a wonderful flowering houseplant that anyone can take care of. They've been a mainstay throughout all of our houses and our stores for years and years and years. They're like one of those traditional old plants that everyone had an African violet in their house, and they could propagate them quite easily, and they flowered all the time. They have their own soil, they have their own fertilizer. They're very easy to pick up and start growing. So if you are interested in a nice little flowering plant, an African violet is a wonderful one that all the components are usually set up right nearby it. And you can just buy the soil fertilizer, get home, and get going, and get a flowering plant to go. Alrighty. Well, I am coming to the end of my presentation, my showcase of all these different plants and pictures that I've culminated to show off at least some beautiful flowering plants for you to have inside. I think in general, you need to just kind of pick up some plants and grow them, take the best care of them as you possibly can, and you will eventually have some beautiful flowers within your house. If not anything, you'll have some beautiful leaves. We have a bunch of other classes on our website for some of these plants. So like I said, the orchids, the bromeliads, the different kinds of bulbs. There's a bunch of different classes that are on some of these that you can learn a little bit more about them, more in depth about all the options that you have, both on our website and our YouTube page. So thank you again for everyone who is watching this the day of recording, as well as anyone who's watching it in the future. Check out any of the other videos if you have some more interest in those. We have an Instagram that is quite commonly posting things about what's in our stores, things that are coming in, beautiful plants that are coming in, the seasonal changes. So if you want to know what plant to get right away, check out our Instagram. I have my Instagram as well, which I'll sometimes update, and maybe I'll put some more pictures on there. Some of these pictures are from that as well. So I had a really wonderful time, and thank you everyone for joining me for that lecture part of my class. And now let's get to some questions. Does anyone have any questions today that we can talk about some plants for the last couple minutes?
Uh, yeah, I think I didn't mention right at the outset, if you would type your questions into the Q&A, we can see them then. And I've had a couple that I've answered quickly. One of them was about cyclamen, and the question was, could you plant the cyclamen out after it's finished blooming in the house? And the answer is yes, definitely. The only tricky thing with cyclamen is that it has a little bulb-like structure called a corm, and that has to be visible above the ground to avoid it rotting. So plant it kind of high so it sticks up, and then the leaves and the flowers come out the top of the corm. And cyclamen go dormant in our climate usually by the midsummer when the ground dries out, and then you just wait for the rain to come, and they start up again in the fall. So just be sure to keep them watered until they naturally die down.
Yeah, and they're definitely one of those ones that we will bring in during those kinds of fall, winter times. And I've seen many people bring them inside. You can have them growing for a little while, but once they're kind of done flowering, it's best to bring them outside and get them growing like some of those other plants we talked about.
I have a question about a leggy spotted begonia. How
Yeah.
how can I propagate it?
Yeah, well, definitely. I think I went through a good kind of propagation method throughout my last class, so definitely check out that one. But in general, once it's getting leggy, a lot of these plants like grow out and they'll even flower, they'll do whatever they want, and they'll produce these longer stems and they'll get kind of tall. If you come in and you look and you'll see little nodes going all the way down the stem, and those nodes are actually where an old leaf was or something like that. And that is where it has the most potential for the plant to both grow its new stems, its new roots, and its new flower stalks. So if you come in and you trim off around each of those nodes, maybe 1 or 2 nodes in each section, and drop those into either some water, and so have the node at least submerged in water, you can put it into some sphagnum moss or some sort of mossier kind of rooting structure, or even a perlite, like a little rockier structure, and have that with water around there. Anytime that those nodes are sitting in some sort of water source, as well as getting some average amount of light, it'll start producing those roots and then those stems, and then the plant will actually propagate from those cuttings. So coming in and just chop it all the way back up, chop it all the way back down to almost nothing. Give it like a 1 or 2 nodes right off the base of the plant. It'll look like a few little sticks in the ground, but it will actually grow back from there quite nicely. And when you do cut it back into that situation, you will more likely get flowers to come, because the new growth is where a lot of flower energy will be put out. And so if you cut it back, new growth will actually have the flowers, and then you'll have a bunch of propagations and more plants for your future.
Fabulous. Let's see. Question about bleeding heart. I
Yeah.
When I grow a bleeding heart in a sunroom, would it survive, or is strictly an outdoor plant?
You
That's
know,
an
it's interesting one. There are 2 types of bleeding hearts. If you come into any of our stores and you ask for a bleeding heart, there are actually 2 genuses, and I cannot remember them. I think one is a Claridendron, I believe, and the other one I cannot remember the name of right now. But one of them is more of an outdoor plant. It has a leaf that kind of almost resembles like cilantro or something like that. Like it has this kind of like fluttery little leaf. And then it produces this cute little pink bleeding hearts. And I would think it's more of an outdoor plant in a shadier situation. I'm sure you could have it inside for a little while, but long term, it's going to probably get a little bit sad, a little bit weak, and not flower as well. And then I think it's a Claridendron. I hope I'm not saying that wrong. Um, there is a one that is producing these larger leaves, and it's more of a vine, and we do get it inside in our indoor house. And they have a whitish and pink little flower called a bleeding heart. And that one is more of a house plant, and you can grow it for long periods of time indoors. I don't think it's really an outdoor plant. So not as common, and you have to kind of find that specimen around whenever a store has it available. But there are possibilities for bleeding hearts inside.
How about African violet that is blooming well but has yellow leaves? Been feeding it with 131. How do I make the leaves better?
Yeah. So 131 is probably the African violet food that we sell. It might be the Espoma one, which is great. Using the African violet food is wonderful. The three being the higher than the one and the other one is just meaning more phosphorus. So that's probably why your plant is producing some really nice flowers. It's producing pretty well. Likely with yellowing leaves, it is coming from either, if it's a pale light yellow, it could be it's getting a little bit too much sun. I've noticed that sometimes people put their African violets in a little bit too bright of a spot, and the leaves start to kind of lighten up and bleach out a little bit. It definitely happened to me. And I still had flowers, but my leaves were kind of, the chlorophyll was not as strong, and it was dying back. I think it was too much sun. But on the other side, it's most likely a little bit too much water. A lot of times we put our African violets in a pot that has a pretty good water retention. They do like a little bit more water, but sometimes too much water will cause the soil to become anaerobic, which means it has not a lot of oxygen. And without that oxygen, and if the process is not really cleaning out itself as much, then the roots will die back a little bit, and that will cause your leaves to get yellowing and not as happy. And sometimes when the leaves and the plant's not as happy, they do also flower more. Like sometimes it's their last ditch effort. I'm dying back. I need to reproduce now. And so sometimes you'll even get a bigger flower show when the plant is actually a little bit suffering. So you kind of need to balance that out. And I would say check on your watering situation, make sure there's good drainage, as well as make sure it's not getting too much light.
All righty. Let's see. The name of the propagation video, by the way, is just Propagation Basics. All of the previous videos can be found easily on the sloatgardens.com website under the Learn tab, and then you'll see webinars and videos. and they're organized by various topics. They're also available on the YouTube channel. And this one today will be available, the recording of it will be available on Tuesday on both the Sloat website and the YouTube channel, so that you can go back and review anything that you want to hear again and skip over the stuff that you don't want to hear again. Although I can imagine there's anything like that. That was really wonderful, Taylor. Appreciate all of the energy that went into that and the great pictures. Your room looks amazing even as we see it behind you right now. And I was not familiar with the goldfish plant. Love it. I'm going to tell our store's buyer to get some goldfish plants in because I want one.
Yeah.
Uh,
Thank you.
so
Thank you. Yeah, no, I did have a lot of fun putting these together. I think it's always a really good time really looking at the flowers of the plants. And I thought I had all these pictures from years and years around to pull together that I was able to kind of show off different kinds of plants forming in different situations. And yeah, I think as a goldfish plant, my last little note about that is I always heard about, giving your niece or giving someone a little goldfish as a pet. I think why not just give them a goldfish plant is a really cute kind of thing you can do, and it makes a nice little gift.